The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 3, Einir. Chapter 2. Rain swept the hill, and lightning flickered all around it. Two small figures, a chosen boy and an ice-carl girl, stood defiantly before the great cloud creatures who towered over them.
We demand a life!
Roared the Stormshepherds together, their voices as loud and blasting as a storm wind.
Who shall pay?
We won't give you anything! Tal shouted as he raised his sunstone ring. He focused his mind on it, and it shone brighter and brighter as he prepared to unleash a blast of concentrated light at the Stormshepherds. At his side, Milla raised her Merwin hornsword. She had a sunstone too, but was not trained in its use. At least, not yet. Tal hoped that her sword would be able to cut through the strange cloud flesh of the Stormshepherds as well as it cut through shadow, back in the castle.
You called us!
The larger of the two Stormshepherds boomed.
Called by blood on Hold Riga Hill, we must take what is offered, and give you a gift in return.
Tal thought he heard an odd tone in the Stormsheperd's voice. It sounded as if it didn't want to take a life, that it was being forced to claim one. He knew that many of the creatures of Einir were bound by ancient spells, magic that the Chosen did not know. Perhaps these Stormshepherds were subject to such a binding, which made them take a life if blood was spilled on this particular hill. "We didn't mean to call you!" he shouted back. It was hard to talk with the wind howling around the hilltop, and the constant spray of rain that came with it, not to mention the growling thunder of the Stormshepherds, and the crackle of the lightning in their hands.
Yet call you did,
roared the Stormshepherd. It sounded almost sad. As it spoke, it raised its hand higher still, and then suddenly threw a whole fistful of lightning at Tal and Milla. "Ruh!" shouted Milla, but her warning was cut off as the lightning exploded at their feet. Ice-Carl and Chosen were blinded and stunned, and then deafened as the thunderclap rolled around and around the hill. Tal wasn't sure what happened next. He crawled around on all fours, fingers squelching in the mud. He tried to get up and face the attackers, to counterattack with blasts of light from his sunstone, but he couldn't see or hear. He collided with Milla, and they both fell onto their backs. When Tal tried to get up, he felt an overpowering force pushing him down into the mud, pressing on his chest and shoulders so it was hard to breathe. He struggled, but it was no use. "Milla!" he shouted. His own voice echoed inside his head, but he couldn't seem to hear it through his ears. He couldn't use his sunstone either because he couldn't see it. He had to be able to see the light to focus and bend it to his will. Otherwise, all he could do was make it glow. If only he still had a shadow guard, he thought. It could have done something. But it was free now. Free, because he was old enough to bind his own spirit shadow, to make one of the creatures of Einir his servant, to cross back with him to the castle, and old enough to bind a spirit shadow. Tal could try and bind the Stormshepherd that was holding him down. He could make the creature serve him. It might be the only way to save their lives. Even so, Tal hesitated, thoughts flickering through his mind like the Stormshepherd's lightning. He could only bind an Einirian to be his spirit shadow once. It would be the most important thing he ever did. His spirit shadow would influence his position in the castle, would help him rise to violet, or fall to red. He had always thought he'd look over many different Einirian creatures before he made his choice. He would weigh up their advantages and disadvantages, talk with his parents about which creature would be best, discuss it with his friends. Tal didn't even know what a Stormshepherd's spirit shadow would be like. He'd never seen one, either in Einir or in the castle. Maybe they made really rotten spirit shadows. Only, if Tal didn't bind the Stormshepherd, he would probably die. Then there would be no one to save Gref, or his mother, or Kusi, or to find his father. What would Rerum do? Tal asked himself. Tal could almost hear his father answer, feel his grip as they clasped forearms in farewell. Look after your mother and the children, Tal. I'm depending upon you. Tal felt the beginning of a sob rise in his throat. He had failed so far. His mother, Grail, was in a coma. His brother Gref was a prisoner, taken by a spirit shadow that Tal hoped the Codex would identify. His youngest sister, Kusi, was being fostered by his cousins, friends of Shadowmaster Sushin, Tal's declared enemy. His father, Rerum, was lost. The only clue to his fate, a scratched name in an illegal prison pit back in the castle. Tal's mouth set in determination. He would not fail any more. He would do whatever had to be done. His choice of spirit shadow was nothing, though he couldn't help but feel a pang as he decided to give up a precious, long-cherished dream. He would bind the Stormshepherd. But he had to be able to see. Tal started to blink very quickly, hoping that would help. Surely he was only temporarily blinded. What if the Stormshepherd killed him before he could see? But then they only wanted one life. The blinking did help. Slowly, Tal's vision returned. Patches of fuzzy color joined together and became sharper. The Stormshepherd was holding him down with just one cloudy finger. The other Stormshepherd needed 2 of its 3 fingers to hold Milla down. Tal's arms and hands were free. He could see his sunstone again, despite the constant rain and the howling wind that whipped around the Stormshepherds. Off the hill, it wasn't even raining. Tal had practiced binding Ainerian creatures for many years. It was the culmination of all of a chosen child's training, when they bound a creature and brought it back to the castle and the dark world to serve them as a spirit shadow. He knew all the spells and rituals by heart. First, he must mark the bounds. Then he had to speak the words. Finally, they had to share the shadow. He had never thought he would do any of these things while lying on his back, with an all-too-solid Stormshepherd's finger pressing him into the mud.
Which one of you shall die?
Roared the Stormshepherds, once again speaking in unison. This close, their voices were deafening. Tal answered, but not in words. Instead, he raised his sunstone ring. A narrow beam of orange light sprang out of it, going straight through the nearest Stormshepherd. It didn't seem to notice, but the beam wasn't meant to harm anyway. It was a marker. Tal quickly used the beam to draw a circle that included the 2 Stormshepherds and Milla, as well as himself. Where the beam of light struck the ground, the grass and mud took on an orange luminescence. Constrained by the Stormshepherd, the circle was a bit wonky. Certainly it wouldn't have got Tal a pass mark back in the lectorium. But it was a closed circle of light, and so Tal had completed the first part of the binding of a spirit shadow. He had marked the bounds.
What are you doing?
Asked the Stormshepherd. It didn't sound disturbed, just curious.
You only need to decide which one of you is to die.
Now Tal spoke, but it was a spell that he chanted, not an answer. He did not know what the words meant, for he had been taught them by rote, and they were not of a language used by the Chosen. Because of this, he had practiced speaking the words almost every day for years. Binding a spirit shadow was the act that marked the beginning of his adult life, and the type and strength of the spirit shadow he gained would greatly influence his ability to rise through the orders of the castle. Tal suppressed a sudden image of himself trailing through the red corridors, while everyone laughed behind their hands, whispering, "Look at his spirit shadow! He bound a Stormshepherd. Can you believe it? Mestral all tel, Astur, Mestral all lameth, Amsal geborn yeo nebedi." "What are you doing?" Milla shrieked. She threw herself forward so violently that the Stormshepherd holding her had to use its 3rd and last finger to bring her under control. "You can't say that!" "What?" exclaimed Tal, shocked by the sudden outburst. In that moment he lost track of the spell. The words had to be said exactly, without pause. He had felt the power building in them and had known he would be able to bind the Stormshepherd. Now, as the power of the words dissipated, the bounds faded too. Milla had spoiled his one chance to bind the Stormshepherd. If he'd managed it, he could have set his new servant against the other Storm Shepherd. They wouldn't have had to choose who had to die. "You've ruined it!" Tal shouted. He tried to roll over to Milla, but the Cloudfinger held him fast. "Ruined what?" asked Milla angrily. "How did you learn the crones talk?" "You have to decide," interrupted the smaller Storm Shepherd. "One of you has to die." "Shut up!" Tal yelled. Surprisingly, the Storm Shepherd did. "What do you mean, crones talk? I was speaking the words. I was trying to bind the Storm Shepherd and save your stupid life." "It was crones talk, the old tongue," insisted Milla. "The prayer to Astir, which can only be said by a crone mother. It is forbidden to everyone else." "How do you know that's what I was saying?" asked Tal. The two Storm Shepherds nodded, as if he'd asked a good question. "I have heard it," said Milla, her voice low, 5 times. "The last was only a half-circling ago, when Olaf Snowswimmer slew Ephraim No-Nose in his sleep. Olaf would not accept the judgment of the Crone Mother, and she had to say the prayer." "What happened?" growled the smaller Storm Shepherd. All the lightning that it had held in its hand was gone now, and its eyes sparked more brightly. "The Crone Mother called on Astir, and she made Olaf walk into the living sea," said Milla. "He was not crushed by the Selski, but caught on a fluke and dragged for many stretches across the ice before he died." Tal was silent. Astir was one of the words in the binding spell, repeated several times. But how could the Chosen's binding spell be the same as the Icecarl's prayer to Astir?
"This is all very interesting,"
grumbled the larger Storm Shepherd.
"but you still have to decide. Which of you is to die?"